Hey everybody, Ian here, and today I am joined by Don Grossinger, mastering engineer extraordinaire. Don, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
It's a pleasure. Not only is it going to be fun for me to revisit some of my old haunts, but to get this updated situation done so that I'll be more known to people in the 21st century will be a definite advantage.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I thank you for contacting me.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. My pleasure. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I'm most familiar with your DMM work at Europadisk, but as I looked into your bio, you just have a very interesting story, and so just speaking with you now for the first time, you're obviously from the New York area. Is that fair to say? So, like, where did you grow up?
I grew up in New York. Earliest memories are in Far Rockaway in Edgemere, right by the Atlantic Ocean. My grandfather owned some bungalows, which were used in the summertime for folks coming out of the city who wanted to breathe the sweet summer air. And so that was Edgemere and Far Rockaway in Queens, New York. Then we moved up to Bayside on the other side, and I watched them build the Throgs Neck Bridge through my window.
Wow.
And then eventually we found our way out to Oceanside, and that's where I went to school and high school and all that good stuff.
Okay, yeah. And so as I understand it, you started working in music very early on, not in mastering. You had, I think, maybe some kind of production company or some kind of event company or something?
Yeah, I sort of split myself into three beings. I had a company that did security and backstage crew and roadies for bands coming into town. The security thing was a steady gig, and we were priding ourselves on we were nonviolent security people. So it's not like we were looking to kick people out just to keep them out of the aisles and all that good stuff.
Nope.
But I saw some astounding shows, historical shows, doing that. That was in Washington, D.C. I went to college at George Washington University.
Okay.
And at GW, I was in the program board, and we got started. This is how I got started in the official music business. Also at GW, I was in their radio station and rose through the ranks to become my assistant program director or something like that. But
okay,
I was
is that maybe
in
where
love
you
with the
started to
radio.
sort of lose? Is that maybe where you started to learn how to use equipment?
Yes. I was hot stuff because I had a what was it called, a Switchcraft 10-band EQ. You know, and I used to collect all sorts of music that was unavailable to the public. And there was a network of people that traded this stuff back and forth and around. It started out for us being Grateful Dead aficionados,
Sure.
but it later spread to encompass all kinds of music from the 1940s through the present day.
And these were reel-to-reel tapes typically, or what format would this have been?
I did not like to use cassettes because of the limitations. I used them only under necessity when there was no other way to get the music. The music was the primary thing. And so I used reel-to-reel tapes. I had two Tandberg 3000 recorders. And so I used to dub there if necessary. And I had a friend who had a big Tandberg, the ones that sat on the table, and I think it was a 9200, but I'm not sure. So we traded tapes, and I started doing. I got into the situation where I started doing sound for
like front of house.
Local, yeah, house sound and lights for an incredibly wide variety of artists. I was doing sound and lights at Blues Alley, which was the nightclub in DC for touring blues musicians and jazz guys. I worked with, geez, the list is endless. Ron Carter, Carmen McRae, God, Joe Pass, Howard Roberts, Dexter Gordon, McCoy Tyner.
Wow.
and the list goes on and on. Elvin Jones.
Any of the
Uh,
70s fusion groups like Weather Report or any of them?
this was a bar, a nightclub, and we didn't have room for large
They were too
amounts of
big.
equipment.
Yeah.
It did exist. I did security for Weather Report, security and stage crew. That was part of my other, persona.
Yeah.
And I was also managing a bike shop at the time.
Okay. That was sort of by
I was
day you're
just-
doing that, and by night you're recording bands and doing security and whatnot.
Right.
Gotcha.
Right.
And so that was mainly in the 70s, it sounds like, right?
Yeah, probably so. Yes. As a matter of fact, I'm sure it was, because by 76, I was working at a radio station, the preeminent radio station for music down in the DC area, WHFS FM, 102.3 on your dial and stereo. And
You were DJing?
yes, I was definitely DJing.
Uh-huh.
And this was a unique station in that nobody told us what to play or what we couldn't play. We just had to stay away from the naughty words that got you in trouble with the FCC.
Right.
But after that, aside from that, sky's the limit.
Yeah.
And we played everything, and we had touring musicians come in. I did interviews with Bob Weir and Peter Tosh and Captain Beefheart. I sat in on Captain Beefheart.
Yeah.
And all sorts of musicians came through. Linda Ronstadt and Jackson Brown and Lowell George from Little Feat and Bruce Springsteen were all habituates of this radio station.
Wow. That's great. How much exposure did you have to go-go music being in DC?
That didn't happen till later on.
Oh, I see.
Charles Brown was the guy, if I remember his name correctly.
Mhm.
And I ended up mastering and cutting his music, but that wasn't until years later.
I see.
It was running on sort of a parallel universe. Most of the pure music mastering and disc cutting all happened in New York City. I went up to New York in 1981.
81, according to your bio here, yeah, that you started it at Frankfurt Wayne Mastering Labs. Does that sound right?
Well, there was stuff before that. You can edit out any of this that is not relevant, but I had moved back up to New York because I was offered a job at a recording studio up here, and the person who offered me the job, my contact, was Peter Thomas. He was the voiceover man. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he did stuff like IBM and Coca-Cola and really major voiceover stuff. And we got to be good friends, and he recommended me to this place.
Okay.
So I dropped all my 5 jobs down in DC and came up to New York, expecting to have, my future taken care of, at least in terms of certainty of work.
After at least 10 years away, right? You had been away from New York for a long time at that point.
Exactly. And so I was going up to an unknown location for me. I had a firm base of clients of all sorts in DC, but I came up to New York and didn't know anybody. And then to top it all off, 3 months into my stay there, the company went out of business.
Oh, God.
So here I was in New York, and I had left DC, the familiar confines, and I had no job. So I happened to see an ad in the Village Voice for a friend of mine who I had done sound for in Washington, and she was up here. She was a singer-songwriter. So I decided to go down and see her play in the Village and see if maybe she had some contacts for me or what was going on. So I did, and got a big greeting. Hi, how are you? Good to see you. Why don't you sit down? My boyfriend's coming in half an hour, and he'd love to talk to you. So I met Tom Steele, who owned Frankfurt Wayne Mastering Labs. And a half an hour after I met him, I had a new job.
No kidding.
Yeah, he owned this mastering studio, and we had a chance to sit and talk over drinks for quite a while. And right on the spot, he said he needed somebody, and I fill the need. So I had a job, and I was feeling really good about that.
And this was cutting lacquers?
This was before I was entrusted with cutting lacquers. I went through a pretty intensive, what's the word? I started out at Frankfurt Wayne, starting out back to emptying the trash and cleaning up and going for errands and starting way at the bottom again, which I wasn't used to doing. I had a pretty high visibility role in Washington, D.C., and I come back down and I'm reduced to doing, starting all over again.
Yeah.
But that's what you had to do, and so I did it, and I got advanced to the tape copy room, and then I got put into mastering studios with the guys who knew all the stuff and did all the stuff, and I was supposed to learn. Apprenticeship is the word I was looking for.
Okay, sure, of course, yeah.
Yeah, so I had an apprenticeship, and I was working at Frankfurt Wayne, and they were bringing me up the ladder slowly but surely. And I worked with Tom Coyne, the late great Tom Coyne, and Herb Powers, and Joe Gastwort, and Dominick Romeo, who I'd love to talk about.
Yeah.
At some point. All these guys were famous in the mastering world, but Dominick basically invented the mastering world. He was a mastering engineer before there was any title for the position. He worked with guys like Phil Spector and Ike Tina Turner and George Harrison and all these people who wanted to make sure that they got their stuff optimized by somebody who had impartial ears and a real good musical sense. And Dominick was spectacular. He taught me the ropes.
Yeah.
And
so that's not just learning how to use the lathe, but also EQ and these sorts of things that apply as they apply to mastering.
The whole bucket of wax,
Yeah.
I used to pick them up in the morning in Queens, and we used to drive in together, and every day, or many days. And
the studio itself was in Manhattan?
Yeah, it was actually, you know where it was? No, but I'll tell you. It was in the Ed Sullivan Theater, where Ed recorded his shows, and
yeah.
You could almost hear the residual screams of the teeny boppers as when the Beatles were on.
Yeah.
But and that later became the studio that David Letterman
exactly
walked out of.
So at the time, it wasn't being used as a theater, I imagine, right?
It wasn't being used as anything. We were on the 12th floor, and all the floors had little warrens, small little offices, which were basically the home to one-man companies, all in the music business, all facets of the music business.
Yeah. Yeah, and so Frankfurt Wayne Mastering had their studios there, and they had like, how many lathes did they have? Do you remember?
Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 lathes.
Mm-hmm. Were they all VMS 70s?
No, some of them were an older model of
The 66,
Northern lathe.
the 66.
And we also had some. I'm trying to remember the numbers.
I'm aware of the 66, the 70, and the 80.
Yeah, no, these were not Neumann. These were.
Oh.
They weren't Presto. Well, if I remember it, it'll come to me in 5 minutes. It's getting old sucks, let me tell you.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there were 2 or 3 different kinds of lathes, which was good for me because I got a better overview of the whole scene rather than just learning on one lathe. And I finally got some clients. They forwarded some clients to me, and one of them, I believe, was the guy who did the go-go stuff in Washington.
Yeah.
But I also was the mastering engineer. I did all the work for what was the gospel label?
I don't
Billboard's,
really know that world. Yeah.
Yeah, it was Billboard's top rated gospel record company.
Okay.
For the year, and I did all the mastering. Basically, you couldn't be a specialist. There were people who, like Herbie, did a lot of hip hop, and Tom Coyne did a lot of pop music.
Yeah.
But I had already started years ago listening to everything.
Sure.
And that certainly came in handy.
Yep.
Because I had to learn to work for Miles Davis one day, and the Love and Spoonful the next day, or whatever.
Yep.
And so I used all sorts of equipment.
Yeah, and so it looks like you spent about 4 years at Frankfurt Wayne before moving on to Masterdisk.
Right. I was approached by Doug Levine, who owned Masterdisk, and he was looking for an engineer, an assistant engineer, basically to start. But I was being brought on to be Bob Ludwig's production engineer, as well as my own clients, as well as cutting demos and finished lacquers for all sorts of groups. But I was basically,
what does it mean to be a production engineer for Bob Ludwig?
You wouldn't believe the quality of the stuff that came through. First of all, you knew that it was demanding. You knew that it was going to be on the air, and it was going to be big, and you had to get it exactly right.
Yeah.
It was an amazing thing. I did the big Tina Turner album that came out, and the first Mariah Carey album.
So when you say you did them, that means you cut the lacquer for them?
Yeah, I cut the lacquer for them, and sometimes when there were singles mixes that didn't go on the album but were released separately, I used to EQ those and do mastering work on those.
Yep.
And I got to work with the Police and Springsteen and R.E.M. You can go on and on. I mean, it just never stopped. Every night was a new treat.
And by 1985, CDs had come out. So
Right.
to what extent were you also doing digital mastering for CDs?
Well, I had already sort of begun doing my own clientele, and everybody liked wanted to be first on the block with new digital stuff.
Yeah.
So I started with I think it was a Sony unit. It was a 1610 maybe. It was a 14-bit, not 16-bit, 14-bit machine.
Really?
Yeah. And we used it for for clients. That was whatever state of the art was at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
And then we started climbing the ladder, and the 1600, the 1610, and the 1630 were all Sony machines. And I used to use what was I'm trying to remember the name of the software, Sonic Solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard of Sonic Solutions at all?
Yeah, I have.
It was early, but they gave you at least some greater flexibility in terms of EQs and compressors and things you could use to make the right sound, for the clients.
Right. This is still a digital tape-based system, though, right? This wasn't like a hard drive thing. This was digital tape.
Yes, this was digital tape.
Yep.
I believe for a while we were putting the tape on Super VHS tape stock.
Yep. Yeah. My first band, this was in the mid 90s, but my first band, we recorded on ADATs with Super VHS tapes. Yeah.
Yep. So that was the story of Frank at Masterdisk.
Yeah. And at Masterdisk, so you learned how to cut lathes at Frankfurt Wayne, cut lacquers at Frankfurt Wayne, and then you're also doing that at Masterdisk and also doing digital mastering at Masterdisk. And I was in looking into this, I was surprised to find out that Masterdisk must have also had a DMM lathe. Is that right?
Yes.
Because I've got a couple of records that are cut DMM with Masterdisk.
This one.
Public Enemy, Nation of Millions, and then this is Slayer's Seasons in the Abyss. These were both cut at Masterdisk and both have DMM etched in the runout.
Did they also have like a treble clef in the runout?
No, I don't think it's you. I couldn't make out. I can't make out the who it is. Well, this one says, well, that's probably the catalog number because it says BL something, but I don't think that means Bob Ludwig.
No.
This one appears to be like AG or A6. I don't know. I don't see what looks like your signature at least.
Well, I definitely did the first go round on those, and N.W.A. and Run-DMC, and basically I was being put into situations where I was dealing with unfamiliar program material, and that was great. I mean, as long as the customers were satisfied, then it was really something that I could be proud of, that I was able to deal with all these various kinds of music without blinking an eye, and just making them sound right intuitively.
Yeah, and so you must have learned to use the DMM lathe at Masterdisk, is that right?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, I brought here, I also did some college stuff. Let me see. I did some college courses for Institute of Audio Research, where they sent in students to learn the background of the recording process. And in so doing, okay, this is a DMM copper.
Yeah.
Let me see what I got here.
So of course in DMM you're not cutting a lacquer, you're cutting a soft copper disc.
No, it's a metal hard copper disc.
I imagine it being fairly soft so that you could etch a groove into it, but it's pretty hard, you say. Look at that.
It's copper, you know. It's a piece of copper, no question about it. But what was wonderful about it was that in cutting the copper, you were simultaneously cutting the mother.
I kind of wanted to ask you about that. Yeah. So my understanding with the lacquer is you cut the lacquer, it gets plated, and then a father gets made from that, and then a mother gets made from the father, and then a stamper gets made from the mother. Does that sound right?
And you get a pressing like this out of the machine.
Oh wow, that's a raw pressing that hasn't had the edge cut off yet.
Correct.
Yeah.
Sonic Youth, can you see that there?
Yeah, I do. Yep, that's their. Yeah, my brother has that record. I know that record. Yep.
So yeah, and what that allowed you to do, let me see here. This is another copper.
Yeah.
I'm looking for one which I might or might not see immediately. The coppers that I cut at Masterdisk were of all genres of music. And one of the advantages of the copper was that it cut very narrow grooves that didn't have a great deal of groove depth at the bottom of the cut in this area here and down lower.
Yeah.
So there was good and bad to it. The good news was that you could fit more program material on a copper disc than you could on a lacquer disc because there was less excursion and the grooves are narrower so that you could fit more of them in physically.
And did the rigidity of the material also allow the grooves to be closer together?
Absolutely. The lacquers wanted to be prepared for manufacturing to be plated as soon as possible.
Right.
At Europadisk, when I was cutting lacquers, we had a complete setup with half a dozen lathes, half a dozen presses, And so we could keep our workload more even by cutting more each day rather than doing a batch and getting them sent out. So so you had the additional time, you had the narrower grooves, but the narrower grooves led to a slight problem in that they provided a sort of a slightly different sound to the program material than people were used to with lacquers.
I agree. Yeah, that the DMM kind of imparts. There is kind of a DMM sound, and so that's where it comes from. You think is those shallower grooves basically?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure of that. But when I was back at Europadisk after leaving Masterdisk, Bob was going up to Maine. I didn't want to go, so I stayed at Masterdisk for a while, and then I went over to True Tone Mastering, Carl Rawati's place.
Yep.
And that was good for a while. And then I went to Europadisk, where I was chief mastering engineer for like 11 years there. And
gotcha. So that's why. So Bob left to start his own place, right? Gateway, right?
Right.
And that was in, let's see, that must have been early 90s.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And but just to get back to the DMM at Masterdisk real quick, did they have the DMM lathes when you first started at Masterdisk in '85? Did they already have DMM?
No.
Gotcha.
The DMM lathe was placed in a room that was exclusively earmarked for DMM cutting.
Mm-hmm.
And we just went in there and cut DMMs all the time. And then they also had the regular lathes at Masterdisk where we cut in a more standard procedure kind of thing.
And was there a learning curve with the DMM lathe, or did everything operate essentially the same?
Oh, is there a learning curve? You had to get used to a whole nother style of cutting. What am I trying to think of? The whole process had to be rethought and redesigned, sort of. So there I was. What gave me headaches was the fact that a lot of the work that I did over at Europadisk was dance music and hip hop. And everybody in the dance music world wanted the loudest record they could possibly get. And the same thing with hip hop and rap music and all that. And these were two genres of music that I had no knowledge of whatsoever coming in.
And there's a lot of bass in that kind of music too. Does that maybe present challenges?
Yes. So that was what it was. So you were trying to make the music as loud as possible on the disc so that it would cut through the background noise and everybody else's cuts. And it was a very competitive situation. I had to cut louder or as loud as the loudest lacquer lathe. And DMM was not set up. It was designed as a system to be used on classical records, where you were not going to have a lot of heavy bass excursions.
Right? Was it maybe Deutsche Grammophon that came up with DMM? I keep trying to remember. Do you happen to know?
It sounds right. It was definitely a German. Did it say anything here? It was definitely a German development. But I had to learn it. You know, you had to figure out a way to get around the problems and still make use of the advantages. Another thing that was very difficult to deal with was the fact that style, groove, loudness, the sound. Because some of these DJs could tell the sound of the DMM stuff as it was being played in clubs and all that.
Yeah.
So I was constantly saying, but look at the advantages you get, you know. Oh, something this is what I was thinking of before. You also have to be very cautious about the possibility. I lived on the edge. The strain being put on the system due to the dance music and hip hop music program meant that when I was pushing the limit for level, I was also pushing the entire system, and I had to make sure that none of the circuit breakers tripped and that I didn't blow cutter heads.
Yep.
I remember seeing in one of your previous interviews,
Jeff Powell talked about blowing cutter heads.
Yeah. I lived with the fear of blowing cutter heads every day. And I got to know Chris Muth and who's the guy from IAR? Older man. I'll think of his name in a few minutes. But between the two of them, between Chris and this other guy, they were the guys to go to make sure your system was properly calibrated and that hopefully you didn't blow cutter heads, because they were $10,000 a piece.
Yeah.
And when you make a $10,000 mistake, you don't make a happy company owner.
Right.
But by God, I got through it, you know. Learned how to use the advantages and skirt my way around the disadvantages and still come up with an ungodly loud record. And the proof was in the sales, because for a while I was doing between 20 and 35% of the dance music on the Billboard charts every week.
Yep.
And hip hop also.
Yeah. And so with oh, I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, so the coppers. So where do you get the copper blanks from?
We made them.
You made your own
in-house. Beneath the copper is a strata of stainless steel, I think it was. So you plated you got your stainless steel blank, and that was silver on both sides. Then you put the coppers into a bath of chemicals, and that chemically bound up with the copper so that it was a copper strata, and below it was another kind of metal that allowed, and as a matter of fact, the metal that I was talking about here was one of the problems with the coppers, because the thickness of the plating on top of the steel was very low. There wasn't, you could dig real deep into a lacquer disc because the depth of cut was possible, but you only had this much to dig into with copper. So you had to watch out for all these things.
Wow. And so, okay, so you're making your own coppers, and then you're cutting grooves into those coppers. And then
we made the mothers, we made the stampers, and we made the pressings. So it was all a unified operation at Europadisk.
At Europadisk. And so, like, what I'm trying to understand is, like, so with a lacquer, there's sort of like a limited number of ultimate sort of pressed discs, pressed records that you can make from a given lacquer, right? There's do you have these same limitations in DMM? So,
nope. So you could make as many stampers as you wanted.
Because is the copper that you're cutting, is that essentially the mother, or a mother is made from that copper that you cut?
Well, we made from the coppers are stampers.
Yeah, you made stampers directly from the copper that you cut.
From the copper, yeah.
Gotcha.
As far as I recall.
Yeah, so like when I was talking to Robert Griffin from Scat Records, so you had cut at Europadisk, you had cut a bunch of Guided by Voices records, DMM.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
And yeah, he said that made his current reissues of these so much easier. He didn't didn't have to do new mastering. He could use your 1995 copper masters.
God bless him.
Which he did. Okay, so that that's sort of another advantage of DMM, basically, right? Is that you don't have to keep cutting replacement lacquers. You can just keep using that same copper to make more stampers.
Right. I mean, I'm sure there's a limit somewhere down the road, but
Right.
it's not like the traditional method.
Yeah. And so DMM seemed to spread pretty fast in the 80s. Like so Masterdisk got a DMM lathe. I learned through doing this, through looking into my DMM collection before we talked, that Sterling had a DMM lathe. Apparently, this is a Sterling DMM cut. There's this other one that I can't tell who this was, but it's a DMM. What's written in the runout is the word Zorro. Do you have any idea who that would be?
It does not sound familiar.
Yeah, but it says DMM there, and then K-Disc apparently had a DMM lathe. This is a DMM cut, and I looked at the runout, and it has a K-Disc stamp. I was surprised to see.
There were a few of them around. It was great. It was like a baseball game or something. There was definitely competition among the various facilities as to who could cut the loudest records. And I was in there. And
I have the impression, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I have the impression that DMM in a way was a bit of a last gasp of the record industry, that the record industry had to find ways to compete with CDs. CDs were out now, making records sort of obsolete, and so we kind of needed some new technology for vinyl to make vinyl seem worthwhile, and that DMM maybe was part of that. Do you think there's any truth to that, or am I kind of making that up?
No, I think that sounds viable, because the timing was exactly as you stated, and we began to get tools to EQ and work with CDs rather than working with vinyl records.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay, so let's get to Europadisk now. So Bob Ludwig left Masterdisk to start Gateway, and you said you went to True Tone for a little bit, and then ultimately went to Europadisk in '95. And so I imagine you had a great resume for them, basically, right? You've been cutting DMM for several years at that point, and there probably weren't necessarily a lot of people who knew how to even do that.
I was like a brain surgeon. There are many there are many out there. It was definitely a limited number of people that shared that piece of equipment because it was very expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, the old lathes, the older Neumann lathes, and the other ones as well, probably hadn't made any new ones in 20, 30 years.
Exactly. And so you get to Europadisk and you cut, so at least stuff from my collection, you cut a whole bunch of Guided by Voices records. They did a box set of all of Guided by Voices early records. And you cut all of those. You later cut this album, Deerhoof's Apple O.
Deerhoof, I sort of remember, yeah.
Yeah, like I'm kind of curious, whenever I talk to mastering engineers, I always sort of wonder if they have any memory of any individual album at all, because you've worked with so many albums over the years that how would you even remember these things after a long time? But do you have any memories of this by any chance?
Not specifically. It was one of a group of new rock and roll bands. Afghan Wigs I cut also. They were sort of in that genre.
Yep.
Sonic Youth, although they were a little bit more electronic. But there are definitely projects that I did that I'm so proud of that I remember them really well. Do you have any memories of that Guided by Voices project? That doing it would have been 6 total albums, so 12 discs
But that would have been
Uh,
very early on in your Europadisk career, because that was from '95.
yeah, that doesn't hit me quite so forcefully. But I'll tell you ones that did. Should we bring that up now?
Please, yeah.
Um, I did. I was sought out by Brian Wilson's people to do the vinyl cutting for Smile,
Hmm.
which was a huge project back then. And myself and the chief engineer over at Masterdisk made a completely unique and special chain of playback equipment to use the, I think they gave us direct stream digital, DSD,
DSD, yep.
masters. And we cut from that. Either that or, no, I'm sorry, DSD was something else. These were cut from, the Smile records were cut from analog tape with CCIR setup for the playback heads.
And this Smile, this was the like, there's been a couple of different editions of Smile. Brian Wilson sort of like re-recorded his own version of Smile at a certain point, and then I think later they released the stuff that was recorded back in 1966.
Right. This
Well,
is Brian Wilson's Smile.
gotcha. So
And
a
one thing that
contemporary recording of it, yeah.
yes, one thing that I'm super proud of is that if you play the record and the CD back to back or simultaneously, and Bob Ludwig did the mastering for CDs, but I had I invited all the local engineers, and we had a little dinner slash meeting, and we played the CD right immediately back to back with my cut, and the cut on the album just completely blew it away. You know, the sound was so much warmer and rounder and correct. It was very very satisfying.
That's great.
Um,
And you cut that direct from
also,
tape.
yeah, that was from tape. That was from analog tape with a instead of using a digital delay line to cut the masters. Are you familiar with the what has to go into making a cut from vinyl?
Well, basically, you need a preview. You need a tape machine with a preview head, right?
Or you need a digital delay line with the delay being 0.666 of a second for digital tape, and some other figure 1 point something for analog tape.
Mhm.
The distance between the preview head and the playback head.
Yep.
But we did we removed the digital delay line, so it was a pure analog cut. The preview was analog, the program was analog, the cutting system was analog, all the and I had to do some re-EQing to get everything to sound right, and that turned out really well, I thought. And also, I was able to work on 10 albums by the Rolling Stones
Yeah.
on DMM, and that was like, you know, the gods have descended from heaven and
I'm sure
have delivered this project to me.
that's going to be an absolute career highlight. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you
And it
remember
was
what
a
you cut
demanding.
from? Are you allowed to divulge what you cut from for those?
I think that was the DSD.
Mhm.
That was the direct stream digital.
Yeah.
And you would hope that I could cut direct from that with no additional EQ, but that was not the case. I had to EQ the tracks so that they would sound like or better than the digital.
Yep.
So that was pretty neat. And it was all the old albums. It was the first 10 albums, everything up to, but not including Let It Bleed. So everything that came before Let It Bleed, I recut.
Yep.
And that was a lot of fun. But it was
Okay.
demanding because I knew where it was going, you know? I knew who was going to be listening to this.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah, Yeah, no pressure.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Okay, and so that was also during your Europa Disc days, right?
Smile was in Masterdisk. The Stones were in Europa Disc.
Gotcha. Okay, so then Europa Disc came to an end for you in 2004, and I think Europa Disc closed maybe a year later.
Yeah, the writing was on the wall.
That's what I was just going to ask. Was the writing on the wall? And okay, it was, yeah.
It was just not pulling in the same kind of project quantities as used to.
Yep. And
isn't it really funny? Let me just break in for a second. Isn't it really funny and ironic how something that you were stuck with at the beginning, a lacquer record, came to the point where you were really pushing it to its absolute physical limits. But while that was happening, the whole format was going down the tubes.
Yeah. And
now lacquer records are in high demand. You know, it's sort of a funny turn of events.
Yeah, yeah. Like, you know, you were cutting DMM essentially like at the nadir of vinyl records, basically like late 90s, early aughts was probably the bottoming out more or less of the record industry, I'm guessing.
I would have to agree.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I can't remember where I saw that. I either saw this on Wikipedia or somewhere else, but I saw that apparently the Europa Disc DMM lathe was sold to the Church of Scientology. Can you tell me anything about that, like without getting whacked?
Yeah, well, I hope I don't get whacked. Yeah, that is true. We have been making that. First, let me start again. The Scientologists had a DMM lathe already.
Huh.
And we at Europa Disc were manufacturing copper blanks for them. We sent them out in batches of 10 or 12 blank copper discs, which they were recording L. Ron Hubbard's speeches. With the theory being that after the apocalypse, these copper records would be still manageable and playable because they were on such hard material, and not like a lacquer, which would begin to degrade through normal circumstances 3 days after it was cut.
That makes sense. They wanted it to be as permanent as possible. That's
right. And they were going to take over the world because the only thing that would have been preserved would have been the speeches of L. Ron Hubbard.
Gotcha. The speeches of L. Ron Hubbard and a few Slayer albums.
Yes, exactly. One extreme to the next.
Wow. Okay.
That's what I know. And then basically when Europa Disc finally gave up the ghost, so to speak, they sent their lathe over to California.
Okay, and so my impression is like you are the last person to have been cutting DMM in the United States. Does that sound right? Because there were these other places that had DMM lathes, but my impression is they got out of it well before Europa Disc got out of it.
Well, the reason Europa Disc stayed in it is that we had the whole chain. We had the manufacturing, we had the plating, we had the artwork, we had the whole procedure allowed us to stay around longer because we had less overhead and fewer steps that were involved. So we were able to make that work for a while.
Gotcha. And then everybody else getting out of DMM affected Europa Disc because you didn't have coppers to sell out to other places cutting DMM.
Right. What was I going to say? What was the last thing we just said?
We were talking about other DMM cutters that had gone out of business, and that affected Europa Disc.
Yeah. Actually, it's really funny. I worked fairly recently, within the last few years anyway, with the reformed Masterdisk. And Scott Hull is running that operation. And he knows his way around a cut also. But the reason I'm bringing this up is kind of funny. I went in to cut some records with him, and there it was sitting in his cutting room was my last DMM machine. And he had converted it to analog. He took the DMM head off, and between him and Chris Muth, they did whatever modifications they needed to do. And I found myself cutting analog lacquer records on what was at one point the last DMM lathe. And I knew it was mine because there were little yellow sticky pad notes on the lathe in my handwriting.
Yep.
So.
Wow. Okay, so Europa Disc shuts down. According to your bio on Discogs, at least, you worked with True Tone again, at least a little bit, maybe on a freelance basis.
Yep.
And then you struck out on your own with your own mastering house.
Yes.
And so that would have been what, 2000? When was that? 2007 or so? Does that sound about right?
Sounds a little later than I would have gone. I would have gone earlier.
Oh, here it is. No, it's 2005. It says here.
Yeah. That makes sense.
And so were you renting somebody else's lathe, or did you buy a lathe at that point, or did you already have one? How did that work?
It worked in that True Tone allowed me to use their lathe.
So True Tone had their own, and
yeah.
Gotcha.
And so that's where I did all my cutting. Was with Carl at True Tone.
Yep. Carl, is it Carl Saff? Is that his name?
Carl Rawati.
Oh, Carl Saff is someone else. Gotcha. Okay. So to this day, that's where you do your cutting?
Well, I've gotten frustrated by the difficulty to acquire lacquers, blank lacquers, and the lack of pressing plants that do good work. You can find pressing plants, but some of them are really abysmal in terms of quality control.
Yep.
And also because of physical reasons on my end of things, I was unable to scribe anymore because my hands were not as solid as they had been. So basically, I haven't cut a record in a couple of years.
No kidding. Point. So you're not cutting records anymore, basically now.
If somebody were to come to me with a project, I would do it because I'm better now than I was 5 years ago.
Gotcha.
Or 6 years ago, whatever it is. But most 99.99% of my work these days is at Don Grossinger Mastering, and it's digital and it's made for CD or downloads and that kind of thing.
Yep. Gotcha. So all the stuff that you cut then after.
Oh, I know that one. That's
this is one you cut twice, is my understanding.
That's right.
You cut the original at Europadisk, and then you also cut this then about 10 years later.
Yep.
And
there was a group of those albums. They wanted to recut all their catalog, as I recall.
Yeah, and I wanted to this has really confused wording in the liner notes, because it says here 2011 vinyl remastered by Chris Bellman. But
Chris
then
he's with Bernie Grunman, isn't he?
Exactly. But your name is etched in the runouts. So you obviously cut it. So I'm trying to figure. I wonder if that's either like a misprint, or like maybe they were going to work with Chris, but then ended up working with you, but they already had these printed, or maybe Chris did digital mastering before he sent it off to you. Like, do you have any memory of how that all played out?
Yeah, I do, because that was, again, another high profile project that I really wanted to get right.
Yeah.
And it was a demanding one because the music is difficult.
Yep.
Challenging.
Yep.
And so what I understand, pardon me, what I understand is that they did the mastering, the creative mastering, and then they wanted me to go ahead and cut it and make it ungodly loud and you know, do all the things that I was able to do.
Yeah.
But they had their hand mostly in the creative end of things on those releases.
Gotcha. So it sounds to me like they could very well have worked with Chris Bellman for that end of it.
Yeah, that's what I'm
and
saying. It's quite possible. I
Gotcha.
don't know. All I remember is that they wanted my cuts to sound like they wanted them to.
Yep. Yeah. No, and this is a great sounding one. I had this is something I have to explain in almost every episode, but I've had a couple different record collections over the years. I collected records when I was younger, sold them stupidly in 2005, and then about 5 years ago got back into collecting records. So in my original record collection, I had your original DMM cut of this, and now I've got the more recent cut you did of this.
That's interesting. You know, I'd love to A/B that.
Yeah, me too. If I still had the old one, I could do that, but
Yeah.
But I don't. But it's an awesome sounding record, and yeah, I can see where that'd be challenging music. There's just a lot going on.
Yeah. We did a bunch of things with Bob that were also demanding. Oh, you want to hear my excuse the expression, world record? I was able to put 30 minutes of music on one side of a Metallica's greatest hits. Was it Metallica? No, it was Steve Perry. You know what I forgot the name of his band. Steve Perry did
former singer of Journey.
Right. Oh, so and there's absolutely no way that could have been cut on a lacquer disc.
Yeah, that was DMM, right?
That was DMM at its best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the longest side that I personally am aware of from my own collection is one of the sides of Miles Davis's Bitches Brew is like 27, 28 minutes long.
I was able to work on a couple of Miles Davis records.
Do you remember which ones they were?
Cutting those with Joe Gasworth.
Uh-huh. Which ones were those?
We Love Miles, and there was a live Miles Davis album in the 80s.
80s Miles, gotcha. Yeah, I haven't heard much of that stuff.
And Gil Evans came down for the session.
Oh, wow.
And another time I had, oh God, who's Miles' other guiding?
Oh, Tio Maceo, or I'm not sure how he pronounces his name, but
yeah, Maceo. I think so.
Yeah.
And that was quite an honor. And I also worked on. There's so many.
mm-hmm.
I worked on I did the EQ on a Bruce Springsteen record, came out, and R.E.M. Green.
Mm-hmm.
These are the ones that stand out in my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it was Tio Macero with Miles Davis.
Yep. Yeah, he was the producer on pretty much all the 60s stuff, at least, I believe.
Yeah. Well, it went on for a short while, at least afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, I want to think, that's definitely most of what I wanted to talk about. I want to think if there was anything else I wanted to ask you about specifically. Oh yeah, so there are a few places still doing DMM today, but I believe they're all in Europe. So like Abbey Road used to have a DMM lathe, but then I just saw a video interview with Miles Scholl, and he said that they actually traded it for a VMS 80. They traded with what's that place in Holland? I think it's just called Record Industry in Holland.
Yeah.
So now Record Industry's got a DMM lathe, but basically it's become this thing that almost doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't quite died out yet, but it almost has.
It keeps holding on.
Yeah. So like, I guess, um, I wonder if we could just kind of like summarize what you like about DMM and what you don't like about DMM. Like, I think it provides a lot of clarity. I think it sounds really good, but for me, it also does impart a certain sound. Like there's a DMM sound, and I think that there are people that don't like that they wish it didn't impart a sound. I personally do like it. But yeah, what do you have to say about the pros and cons of DMM? What do you like about it? What do you not like about it? Do you miss it?
Well, first of all, before I get into specifics like that, I want to um, wish that everybody who says they don't like DMM would actually give them a chance and listen to DMM. If that's possible. We used to cut DMM reference discs, reference coppers, which would be like a test pressing.
Yeah.
And we could send those out. And generally speaking, if you listen to it and you're fair in terms of your assessment of it, then you could go with it. If I was able to do all this hip hop stuff and dance music, electronic dance music, successfully to the extent that I was, I don't see any other reason why. The sound is, there may be a sound to it, but I think it's a clarity rather than a sound. It's not an additive sound, it's a subtractive sound. And the subtraction, what it is low end and very high end,
Hmm.
the extremes.
Yeah.
I would put a DMM cut record up against analog anytime. I mean, just the Smile. Do you have a copy of the Smile record?
I don't. You make me want to get it, but I don't have it. No.
Well, if you figure out where are you located?
I'm in rural Northeast Iowa. I'm in the middle of nowhere.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Well, I have a couple of copies. You should get yourself a copy of the CD.
I think my dad has the CD.
Well, maybe I could we can exchange addresses, and I'll lend you a copy for the time being for you to give it a listen. I only have like 2 or 3 copies left,
Uh-huh.
and I'm trying to hold on to them.
Sure.
But you would appreciate it, I think.
I'd love that if you were willing to do such a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I could do that.
Hmm.
So advantages: length of product on side, length of program material, clarity, disadvantages would probably, we've covered them all. It's the characteristic sound. It's a perceived lack of warmth. That's all I can think of. I would still prefer to cut DMM, I think,
Uh-huh. So
given my druthers.
yeah. So you miss it. Like it's
Yeah, I
if you had
do.
access to a lathe, you'd like to do it.
Yeah, because not only is it unique, but it gives me a unique um, position in the marketplace,
Hmm.
if you will.
Yep.
I've had a number of people, even the Scientologists, they called me and wanted to know specifics about the lathe that they'd just gotten that I've been cutting on for 10 years.
Hmm.
That kind of thing.
Yep.
So the people that have it and like it really have it and like it.
Yeah.
It's kind of extreme one side or the other.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure we're going to have that chance to do that kind of comparison anymore.
It's dying out. I mean, I don't suppose you happen to have any idea how many DMM lathes were ever made, do you?
Well, I believe that at the time there were only 2 or 3 in the United States.
Yeah.
It was the one that we had at Masterdisk, which later got moved over to Frankfurt Wayne, no, not Frankfurt Wayne, True Tone had one. Anyway, there were only a couple here on the East Coast. There was 1 or 2 on the West Coast. There were the Scientologists. And I think there were 1 or 2 plants in either Germany or Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And there were fewer people who could actually make them work. Chris Muth. There was one really old guy in Berlin who was terrific at rewinding cutter heads, but I can't imagine that he's still with us.
Mm.
It was a strange beast, but I think the advantages outweighed the disadvantages.
Yeah. Yeah, and it seemed like it needed to sort of be all or nothing. Like it needed to either sort of like become the standard in record cutting or not, because it's so specialized and it needs, you know, it needs its own disc. It needs you know, trained personnel to operate the machinery. And so if it can't sort of expand and sort of take over the industry, then it probably just can't continue really.
Well, I was sad to see that the DMM lathe that currently is in use, well, the former DMM lathe that is currently in use at Masterdisk is one of my ex-friends, you know?
Yeah. But they converted it to cut lacquers? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's everything from my end. Anything?
Let me just. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask you if you have any parting words, anything you'd like to add.
Well, I do actively do mastering these days, and I can basically work. In my last 3 weeks or a month, I did a classical solo piano disc. I did a female R&B singer. There was a hip hop single that I did. I'm mastering engineered without borders.
Yeah.
And if people could look me up and find me at dongrossinger.com.
Yep, I'll link dongrossinger.com in the description. Yep.
And I'm still working. I'm officially retired, but right now I've got a very nice flow of people who knew me 10 years ago or 15 years ago and are coming back. They found me. It's very gratifying to have somebody look for you after that length of time.